I think that we have, um, in some ways, prematurely buried the story.
Mhm.
Um, there's for the longest time, people have said, "Oh, our attention spans are getting shorter," and I don't buy that. I think what's happened is that things that can be shortened have been shortened.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Hey, today, Malcolm Gladwell. We're going to talk about his writing process. We'll go behind the scenes and also look at reaching people in a crowded world. How do you actually get your message out? Well, today's episode is brought to you by the Art of Leadership Academy. You know, in leadership, you can find yourself feeling stuck, overwhelmed, and out of ideas on how to lead your church. With my private online community, the Art of Leadership Academy, you finally have a go-to place to get the answers and clarity you need to keep your mission and your church growing. And it's also available at your fingertips 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if you want to join, it's got all my courses in it. Visit theartofleadershipacademy.com and you'll get instant access to training programs and an amazing community. And today's episode is also brought to you by Compassion. Compassion International has been tirelessly fueling believers worldwide to share the good news of Jesus by lifting children out of poverty, and they've been changing lives for over 70 years. So my church has partnered with Compassion for over a decade, and so have I personally. If you want to get involved in really making a difference around the world, go to compassion.com/Carey to learn more. Hey, and if you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, make sure you do, because you'll get incredible interviews like my conversation with Malcolm Gladwell, and we'll go there now. Malcolm, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, so I want to begin by looking at why you decided to revisit The Tipping Point 25 years later.
It was, I was originally just going to do a 25th anniversary kind of refresh,
Like a new introduction or something like that?
Yeah, new introduction, maybe swap out a chapter or two. And then I got into it and I realized, what I really want to do is to write a sequel. I want to go back and rethink everything I approached 25 years ago through the lens of what's happened. Because what I found was, 25 years is is a very long time. And particularly these days, these days these things seem dated after 2 years. So it just seemed like it just seemed weird to kind of do a revision on something that was so rooted in a kind of the pre-internet age, in the pre-pandemic age. There's so much has changed, and we know so much more now than we did about these things. So I decided, no, it would be much more fun to kind of start from scratch and think of this as part two.
Yeah, well, it is an entirely new book. So we'll get into the content of it in a little bit. But I was telling you, it was my weekend read. I got it Friday, I think, and was prepping for this interview. And I got into the first page and I'm like, oh, thank goodness it's Malcolm Gladwell. And you just have such a wonderful way of writing. And you drew me in, like you hooked me. And I thought, this is magic, the way that you write. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us, because this is book number, 6 or 7 for you of major titles, what your approach to writing is. It seems to be a beautiful combination in your different books of like analysis, statistics, narrative, story, and I find it very compelling. So how would you characterize your approach to writing?
Well, I guess I always start with there's always a question I want to answer, and a story I want to tell. And I think of those as being, if you know the story you want to tell and the question you want to answer, it makes your life a lot easier when you're writing. So your story gives you character and plot, and the question gives you suspense. That there's in a lot of the chapters in this book, as in so many of my books, they pose a question at the beginning and the answer is not obvious.
Yeah.
So you there's a reason then for the audience to stay tuned, because there's something they want to know. And it's also, from a writer's standpoint, there's a clear logic to the story I'm telling, because I'm I'm on this quest to reveal the answer to this kind of oddball question. Like there's a chapter in the book on the way we thought about the Holocaust in this country and how for years, decades after the Second World War, no one talked about the Holocaust, which, is so surprising to any of us now who think about it. Oh, we must all have been, but no, it was a subject that just never came up until the 70s. That's sort of an incredible, and then, but that raises this incredibly interesting question, which is why, right? So the minute I start by telling you something that I think you didn't know, and the reason I think you didn't know is that I didn't know. I thought I didn't know there was this kind of like mystery about the Holocaust for 30 years after the war. And then we embarked together on this journey to figure out why. And along the way, we meet this incredible cast of characters. These. So that's a kind of that chapter in the book, which I really love, is a kind of. It's a really good example of the way I like to tell stories. I have a story, and then I have a purpose for the story, and they come together.
Well, it's inductive rather deductive, which I must say, as a podcaster who's interviewed hundreds of people, makes your books not very skimmable, but very compelling. Do you know what I mean? Because sometimes it's like, well, the word Holocaust didn't show up until 1978. And strangely, it was April of 1978. You don't give away the ending. And what makes it really fascinating to me, we live in the attention economy now. That's different than 25 years ago. But it's an interesting combination of what feels like it could be really great fiction, like a screenplay or a story, except it's rooted in facts, analyses, whether that's the Holocaust or what's that town called, Poplar Grove, or whether it's the opioid crisis and the role of OxyContin in the midst of it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a masterful storytelling thing. What else about your approach to story have you developed over the years?
Well, one is another difference. When I went back and I read the original Tipping Point, which is my first book. So that's me at the beginning of this kind of journey I've been on. And this is my 7th or 8th book. And there has been a sort of a significant evolution along the way in the way that I tell stories. And one of them is that I was much more reliant. There's always in my stories I toggle back and forth between data and scientific evidence and studies, psychological studies and storytelling. And I think back then I leaned more heavily on the data and the science end of it. And now I lean more heavily on the story end of it. And I think that's an evolution where I've come to understand is that you don't need a lot of I think I didn't have as much faith in the power of scientific evidence in the beginning as I do now. I don't need to give you 7 reasons why researchers believe something to be so. If I pick the strongest of those reasons and build a story around it, I feel that's sufficient. There's a little factoid in the book about I'm just thinking about this at random. There's a little factoid about the black-white test score gap in schools. And, we've known for decades now that if you test a random sample of black and white school children, there will be a gap in their performance, and the gap's not trivial, right? And we've been having this argument about why that gap. I think 25 years ago, I would have spent 15 pages talking about all the evidence for this gap, and then I would have told you a story about it. And now I've realized, no. Why don't I spend 10 pages telling you the story and then give you the strongest and most elegant study to support my claim? That's the shift. I think I'm just more, because in conversation, I'm much more interested in the rhythms of conversation now than I used to be. When I'm talking to you about this, if I can establish my credibility as a on a particular subject, I don't need to spend half an hour combing through the evidence. I can say, Carey, I've looked at the evidence. Here's an example of what many people believe, and then tell you a story. And that's much more likely, I think, to resonate with you. So that's been a big, I think when I went back and looked at the original Tipping Point, I was like, the balance is all off. It's not the way I would write the book today.
Is that an evolution in you or an evolution, because a lot has changed in 25 years, in our attention span collectively, or a mix of both, or something else?
I think it's an evolution in my understanding of how to reach people. At a certain point, I got much more interested. I would always joke with my dad, who was a mathematician and a theoretical mathematician. And I would go on Amazon and I would see what ranking his books were. He wrote these incredibly complex books that were translated into like Chinese and Russian. And they would be, they'd be ranked 20 millionth on Amazon. They would sell like 25 copies a year, but it would be the 25 biggest people in his field, right? It would be like the 25 geniuses who could understand that's who he sold. And so he wrote his books for an audience of whatever, 50 people a year. That's who went to his conferences. That's who could speak his language. And that's one very legitimate, by the way, an extraordinary amount of what is powerful and important in the world is written for a narrow audience. When your brain surgeon writes about a breakthrough in treating brain surgery that will save a zillion lives, they write that up for a benefit of, a couple hundred people in their field, right? That's the way we want it to be. We do not want, I don't mean to diss that in any way, but I began to realize that's not the world I want to inhabit. I really do want to reach as many people as I can. And so I've systematically tried to dismantle all the barriers to to not a mass audience, but I want anyone who's curious and educated, reasonably educated, to be interested in my books. And anything that stands in the way of that, I think has to be re-examined and removed.
I think it's really interesting because it was gripping. And you're right. I mean, I've seen the evolution. I've read most of your books, if not all of them. I think most. And you do spend a lot of time on a story, and you might spend 3/4 of a chapter just sort of explaining what it was like in Poplar Grove or the Jewish community in LA following the second 1960s, I guess you kind of pick it up. Or the whole opioid crisis story through the lens of one or two people, or fascinatingly, the graft and corruption of South Florida, Miami, after the 1970s.
You're not in South Florida, are you, Carey?
Oh, I'm not. No, I'm north of Toronto, so I'm okay. I'm like, I got friends leading churches there. That'll be really interesting.
No, lots of Canadians are in South Florida. That's why
That's
I asked.
True.
I did not know.
No, but I'm thinking about it because you have so many preachers and communicators listening here. One of the things that's been fascinating to me is, the world is getting shallower, more superficial, quick bites, TikToks, quick videos, lots of views, etc. And I think I'm trying to think through, what does it look like to zig when everybody else is zagging? How do you go deeper when the world is getting shallower? And I love the idea of, because we are human beings, for thousands of years, we've sat around campfires listening to stories. We're entangled in people's lives. So that idea of a single story framing a narrative seems really compelling in the right direction to me. Any further thoughts on that, or advice to communicators on, because you mentioned a few times you really want to reach people, and you think this is a more powerful way than stats and graphs and data, et cetera?
Well, I think that we have, in some ways, prematurely buried the story. For the longest time, people have said, our attention spans are getting shorter. And I don't buy that. I think what's happened is that things that can be shortened have been shortened. I have discovered that I'm a huge basketball fan. I don't need to watch 82 basketball games a year to be a basketball fan. I can watch highlights and then tune in on crucial games during the season and the playoffs, right? So is that evidence that my attention span is shorter? No. It's evidence of me understanding that what it means for me to be a basketball fan means I don't need 100% participation, right? Some people do. I don't. But at the same time, I just finished watching that Apple TV series, Presumed Innocent, of which I have many complicated feelings. But, it's, what was it, 8 episodes of roughly an hour each. I spent 8 hours of my life watching that show. By the way, I don't have 8 hours, I will point out. I suspect nor do a lot of people, but I still spent 8 hours watching. Now, is my attention span getting shorter? No. I just invested an enormous chunk of time in a story that was, gripping in parts and in other parts not terribly interesting. But it did hold me, and it took me all the way to the end. And I think what's maybe a better way of saying that is not that our attention spans have gotten shorter, it's that maybe the bar has been raised a little. We will devote attention to something that compels us, that moves us, that has meaning. And I think that's the difference. You just have to try. You have to work a little harder to get people's attention, but they're perfectly willing to give it to you. What was the single most successful literary phenomenon of the last 25 years is Harry Potter.
Yes,
right. Those were enormous books. I can't. My daughters are not quite of the age to read that yet. I can't wait till they are. They're huge. There's like. I have months and months and months of reading Harry Potter to my kids ahead of me, right? That's not a culture with an attention span crisis. It's a culture that responds to great storytelling. That is impatient with lousy storytelling, but not that's given up its attention span.
That's a beautiful call out. I'm really going to camp on those words and think about that as I get ready to tackle my next book. I think you raise some really good points. Can you take us into, 7 or 8 books after 25 years, your books take a lot of research. Can you walk us through the writing process and the research process, what that looks like for you, any habits, disciplines, approaches that you follow these days?
I think this has changed a little bit. I write as I go along, as opposed to doing all the research and then writing it up. I find it much more useful. I learn something, I start writing the chapter, and then I keep adding the more I learn. And each revision usually includes adding a whole bunch of new material. And I find that's the more iterative you can make the writing process, I think the better the writing process is and the less intimidating it is. The biggest issue with starting a book is that you think, I have to write whatever it is, 80,000 words. And you just think, oh, I can't do that, right? It seems too overwhelming. But if you can understand that, no, an 80,000 word book is a book written in 1,000-word increments over the course of a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, whatever. And then you understand, oh, actually, it's quite manageable. And even a nice long chapter actually starts as a very short chapter. And then you talk to someone else and then you go back and you rewrite what you learned. And it gets you in the habit of also understanding that where you start a chapter is not necessarily where you end up. If you start something, you should. I love the idea of I've written half the chapter and then I change my mind. And I realize, oh, actually, no, this is the story about something else. Or the conclusion I drew is premature or, that. And that's when I think stories start to get complex so I try to kind of lower the stakes, in other words, in the writing and nibble as opposed to take big gulps.
Well, that makes it a lot more doable. And it's interesting, in law school, I studied inductive versus deductive reasoning. You're very inductive. It's like we're all on this journey and we will get to the point at the end. But it sounds like that's what your writing and research process is as well, right? You begin with a question and then it's a quest to try to figure out what exactly is happening here.
Yeah. We did at Pushkin, we did this podcast series, me and this one of my colleagues, Ben and Hafri, on the 1936 Olympics. And it was the perfect example of this because it's ended up being 9 episodes. We started without a plan. None. We sat down and we said, we'd like to say something interesting about the 36 Olympics. And we just both started reading. And then I said, I think we should start with this story. And then Ben was like, I don't understand what that has to do with. And I was like, I don't know. Let's just start here. And we did. And then he came back with this. He wanted to do something on Jesse Owens. He told me his idea. And I quietly inside said, that's the dumbest idea. I was like, my suspicion about Ben was Ben goes off on tangents and they're really like, they're for a tiny, 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 tiny audience. And I was like, oh, yeah. Ben. So he goes off and does it. It comes back and it's the greatest thing in the whole series. So the whole point is like, and then I realized, why even bother trying to figure it out beforehand? I didn't know what he was going to do with the material. I'm not even sure he did. He had this idea and he wanted to develop it. And what I really needed to do was just to say, go for it and how can I help? Keep my mind open and let's go on this journey. And then I came back and said, let's go to Alabama. And he said, why are we going to Alabama? And I said, let's find out. And it turns out, that was it's a great last episode of the whole series. But that kind of, more and more, I've fallen in love with that kind of adventure storytelling. Where you don't, my dad, when we used to go, I was reminded of this. This morning I was thinking about this. When I was a kid, my dad, we would go for family drives, and my father, this is before obviously Google Maps and Waze and everything, he never looked at a map, and he loved getting lost. And he would always look at us, and he would say, I'm like 12 years old in the passenger seat, and he would say, "I'm going to follow my nose." And what he meant was, let's figure it out. I mean, we're in Southern Ontario. Like, you can't get epically lost, right?
You're eventually going to hit a Great Lake.
Yeah. You're going to hit a Great Lake. There's a limit. But he would do this in Europe. I mean, he would do this anyway. But his point was, you can't, we're not in the Amazon. Like, a wrong turn is not going to. We can figure this out. And by the way, he began to communicate to me how much fun it was to figure it out. That was the fun, right? And that's that. I realized that a lot of my writing is an attempt to unconsciously capture that feeling of mischief that my father had about, I don't know where we're going. I don't have a map. Your mother may be complaining right now, but let's just figure it out, right? And that is, that's a delightful feeling, when you've bought into that.
It is, one of the, you did some experimenting too with your last audio book, which was really a biography of Paul Simon. Mm-hmm. And what struck me about that, my wife and I listened to it in the car over, multiple weeks, months when we were together. What got me about that was it almost felt like the original source tapes that you would use for an autobiography or a biography of Paul Simon. But it was actually that exploring, sitting in his room, having a conversation. I think it was you and the producer and Paul Simon, just kind of going through his life, going through his career with the odd editorial comment here or there that became the book, right? And it was completely multimedia. Do you want to talk about that approach? Because I think there's promise in it. It was almost like a long Paul Simon podcast that became the book.
Yeah. So this is something I've fallen in love with recently, which is, I've done it more since doing that Paul Simon book. The trick there was, normally when you call up a celebrity and you say, I want to do something on, they say, the publicist says, okay, you've got 45 minutes, right? Yes. That's 9 times out of 10, that's what you get, or 99 times out of 100.
Yeah.
I went to Paul and he said, well, how much time do you need? And I said, I don't know. And to my utter surprise and amazement, he said, okay. And we would meet and just talk. And then he would say, when are we meeting again? And I would do a little happy dance in the car. And I would say, okay. And I would give him a date and we'd go back. And he would, we started meeting him. He has a house in Hawaii. We went to Hawaii. We just met every day in Hawaii and then he came back and he was in Connecticut and we went once a week to his house in Connecticut. And then he went to Texas to do something. And he said, you want to come to Texas? We just kind of kept going. And the longer the conversation became, the much more beautiful and useful it became. And the more opportunities opened themselves up. And I realized one of the huge mistakes that journalists make of necessity, because we can't get access to people the way we want to, is that we never really get below the surface. And with Paul, because Bruce and I ended up talking to him for 40 hours, actually more than 40 hours. Because I did an extra 4 hours at the end, 44 hours. And that's an enormous amount of tape.
That is.
And then that became a raw material for all as you say, as we were recording those, I was in my back of my mind kind of ruminating on it. And all of those chapters that we do are the kind of me kind of riffing on the conversations that we had. These moments, there were just these moments that were just so interesting and so kind of thought-provoking. When we realized how invested he was by the music he was listening to in his early teens, and how incredibly formative growing up in Queens in the 50s was. And there's a whole chapter on the gift of Queens. It's just about all right, so I went home and I was like, all right, so let's figure out what was going on in Queens in 1950. If you were a kid playing on the street, what music did you hear? And if you were a musically minded kid who was actively learning from what you were listening to, how did that influence you? It's very different from growing up as a kid in Appalachia, or growing up as a kid in Nova Scotia, or growing up as a kid in, you can think of all kinds of different places that would have an influence. New Orleans, that was when I realized there was something specific and beautiful about Queens that allowed me to write a chapter around his memories of being a child. Same thing, there's a lot about his dad. By hour 35 of the 40 hours, we realized, he's talking a lot about his dad. This is a man in his late 70s, and his father's still with him, which was moving to me because I had just lost my own father. Yeah. And I realized that's true, that your parents, I had this great fear when my dad died that he would leave, and I realized that he doesn't leave. And you can keep your loved ones alive. That's what grief is your way of keeping them alive.
Wow.
And Paul was still grieving about his father, even though his father had been dead for 30 years. And it was coming up in his music in a way that not even he was conscious of. And then we only got that because we're sitting there listening to him, and we're an hour 35, and we're like, there is so much about his dad, right? So much about it. He would bring up his dad, and he's still fighting in a lovely way, fighting with his father, who was a genius, musical genius, among other things. Clearly, his father, he's in the shadow. Imagine you're a musical genius, you're Paul Simon, and you grew up in the shadow of this kind of, powerful, intimidating, intellectual figure who is a better musician. You think of him as a better musician than you will ever be, right? Now, that's an interesting dynamic for someone who's I think the greatest songwriter of the 20th century, right?
Yes.
Still in the thrall of dad.
Trying to respond to his dad, measure up.
Yeah, and still arguing with it. That's, like I say, that's so there's a whole, I think the best chapter of the book is us getting into his, not in a kind of, and I didn't think it was a kind of cheap Freudian way. I felt it was like an honest way about how, and this, sorry, I have so much to say about this, but this really interesting thing that you don't begin to appreciate your parents until they're gone. Another friend of mine said this to me, that, my father died 20 years ago. I know him better now than I did when he was alive. I've never forgotten that. And I think of that as so insanely insightful.
Your parents have had a huge influence on you, haven't they? Your mom is still with you. Your dad died a number of years ago. How have they shaped you as who you've become? I realize that's probably 90 minutes, 90 days on its own.
Oh, yes. It's many. Well, my dad was someone who took delight in the world. I don't think he ever woke up and said, I'd rather not be here, or I'm not looking forward to the day. I think everything, and I think he knew he had this lovely balance. He was a deeply devout Christian, and it informed his sensibility in the best possible way. He saw everything he did as an expression of sort of God's genius, and he loved flowers, and he saw, they were beautiful, and I think it fueled his faith that someone created this thing that is just insanely beautiful. And he saw mathematics, this thing that came out of him sort of unbidden, as coming from this supernatural spiritual force. I mean, I think that's how he made sense of it, that it was that these incredibly elegant, he participated in a world of incredible elegance. That's what math was to him. And it was, I think it was divine in some ways for him. But it just meant his life. I mean, I think his sort of life was, he had his own share of, like anyone, things he worried about and struggles. Raising a family in Canada in the 70s, when I just was reminded we built a new house in 1977, and the interest rate on the house was, I think it was 20%.
Yeah.
Is that right?
About right.
Yeah.
That was about right for that era.
I can't even imagine the stress he must have been under financially.
My goodness.
I know it just kind of but anyway, but at the same time, that was that idea that it's possible to find enormous joy in learning and experiencing the world. And my mom is just a kind of incredibly empathetic, thoughtful person who loves to listen to people. And that's also been an enormously valuable lesson in my life.
I love your approach because, talking about zigging when everybody else is zagging with the Paul Simon biography, or also, the podcast series you did on the 1936 Olympics, or even this new book, Revenge at the Tipping Point. You can't be on a super tight deadline. It can't be like, I have 3 months to write this book. I have 3 months. So can you talk about, how you've resisted the temptation? I'm sure you have to hit deadlines. It's a major publisher, et cetera, et cetera. But why that's so valuable, and some of the rhythms in your life that allow for that kind of beautiful meandering that may or may not be productive.
Well, a lot of it is the benefit of being as old as I am. When you've been at it, this is what I didn't understand when I was young, which is the sort of store of things, of experiences, of knowledge that you have just by virtue of having been around a while is so great that you can draw on it. A lot of my writing is about seeing parallels between things. And it's easier for me to see parallels at my age than it was at 25, just because I've experienced, so much more in those years. So like there's a gift. It's made me a lot. You give up a certain number of things as you get older, but you gain. It strikes me you gain way much more, and that's one of them. You have like, to go back to that chapter we were talking about the Holocaust. I wouldn't have written that chapter if I didn't remember, which is all about this epic change that happens in the 70s. Having lived through the 70s made me understand that made that chapter possible. It just was real to me, and there are kind of, when you live through something, you experience it in a way that you cannot if you only read about it or experience it secondhand. So that's this.
Fair.
It gives your experiences a kind of depth. My favorite sports writer, Bill Simmons, who's roughly my age, he's very historically minded when he talks about basketball, for example. And so he's constantly saying, this is the best thing, blah, blah, since the 87 NBA Finals. And it's funny in some sense that he's going back 40 years, whatever it is. But it's also really, really useful, because what he's saying is, you can sit back and say, wow, LeBron James is a great player. But it's not meaningful unless you have some understanding of the people who came before him, right? If you can say, well, okay, so I remember Magic Johnson. Is he better than Magic? I remember Michael Jordan in his prime. I have a point of comparison. And, it just allows you to have some kind of, so that's been just an enormous benefit of kind of having some years under my belt.
So if you had advice to young writers, we have a lot of young leaders listening, some of whom want to write or they want to make a contribution, et cetera. Any advice to them on what to really pay attention to, especially trying to break out in a culture and a market like today?
Well, one is patience. I didn't write my first book, Tipping Point, was written. I wrote it in my late 30s, published it basically on my when I was my late 30s, which is probably later than most people. I didn't achieve real success as a writer till I was in my 40s, which is probably later than most people would, I think, imagine success to come. And I think that's expectation number one. Is I think maybe people are in too much of a hurry that you. Particularly writing a book, which is such a kind of enormous undertaking, it's just so much easier when you have more experiences under your belt and more. So that's patience would be one thing. And two, I think I realized in retrospect, I spent a lot of time in my 20s filling the tank with experiences that I could later draw on. And I think that's really important as well, that people really should think of their early years in a career as filling up their brain with building as wide a base as possible from which to work from. That it just becomes incredibly useful in later life when you've got disparate experiences to draw on.
To have something to actually write about rather than, oh, I want to be a writer, right?
Yeah. I tell young writers, don't study writing. Study something else that you can write about. It's much more important to know what you want to write about than to be. Writing itself will come as the more the more practice you have, the better you can become a good writer. But experiences are something you have to go out and acquire deliberately and intentionally. And that's what you should be focused on. What do you care about? Like things people write most powerfully and compellingly about the things they care about. So the first question should be, what do you care about? And if you can't answer that question immediately and emphatically, you shouldn't be writing.
That's a fair point. That's a really fair point. So 25 years ago, any idea what tipped the tipping point? Ironically, what you wrote about happened to your book. It hit a tipping point where it sort of invaded the popular consciousness, sold a lot of copies. A lot of the ideas in the tipping point actually came true in how widespread that book became. When you look back on it, what were some of the factors that made your debut book take off at the time? Pre-internet, pre-social media, pre-influencer, all of that back in 2000.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, I know that I think a good part of it is luck. I think that there was something, I just happened to kind of put my finger in the zeitgeist for a moment. I think that it was a hopeful book at a time that was profoundly optimistic. The early 2000s, I mean, we've forgotten what Cold War was over. World was getting more prosperous by the day. It just seemed like, after years and years and years of anxiety, the world was headed in the right direction. And so a book that sort of talked about how you can create positive change hit a chord. I also, I spent so much time on the road promoting it that in a way that it would be impossible today. But I spent years. It didn't become a bestseller as a hardcover, as it became a bestseller as a paperback.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
really?
It didn't actually hit the bestseller list until my second book, Blink, came out 4 years later.
Really?
And it people read Blink and went back and got Tipping Point. And I had been promoting it in those intervening years nonstop. I just was on the road for just going to one place after another. And so I said, it was very, in that sense, it was very, very old school. It was like a rock band, going from club to club, getting the word out. So there was a lot of shoe leather there. And I still think there's still particularly now, there's still there is no substitute for the particular power of a face-to-face interaction, of doing some kind of event where people see you in person. That is the most important way to reach people. Every other way we come up with to replace that is a compromise.
So even podcasting, not the same as being there in person and doing a live event in your view?
Podcasting, I mean, it's not the same. No, what podcasting allows us to do is it gives us access to a wide range of things that we could never get if we had to do everything in person. So I willingly give up on the power. In exchange, what I get is range. I can listen to podcasts about, track and field. I can listen to your podcast, and I can listen to someone dissect some intellectual thing all on my way to work, right? Can't do that if you have to do it in person. So it has marvelous qualities, but there's no question that if you and I were doing this in front of a live audience of 300 people, the effect of our conversation would be far greater on those 300 in the room.
Well, and probably the questions would be different. I don't know. There's a vibe when it's you and me via Riverside, and there's a vibe in front of a live audience. It's a different experience for sure.
Yeah, I think it's true.
For people who may not have read the original Tipping Point, can you give us the real short thumbnail of what the big idea was in the book? And then I want to get into how you revisited it and came up with the Revenge of the Tipping Point.
Yeah, the original Tipping Point was a book that said the best way to understand how ideas and behaviors move through society, how that kind of change happens, is to think of them as behaving like viruses. That the rules of epidemics don't just cover illnesses and diseases. They also help us explain everything from, why we buy the things we buy, to why we say the things we say, to any kind of contagious idea follows the principles laid down by those who study epidemics. That seems very commonplace today. It was a little less so 25 years ago.
You were writing about going viral before we had that term.
Yeah, that's right. I was trying to that was
before the internet, before social media. The internet was there, but it wasn't easily shareable. Social media changed that a few years after it came out. Your book came out. Yeah. So now you're revisiting the idea. You decided to write a whole new book. And in part, it was shaped, if I understand correctly, by how much you've changed and the world has changed. Do you want to talk about the different angle and any similarities between Revenge of the Tipping Point and the original Tipping Point?
Yeah. So in the intervening 25 years, as we've said, it has become commonplace to understand the movement of ideas and viruses as movement of ideas and behaviors as following the patterns of epidemics. And so what I wanted to do is to say, okay, well, what are the consequences of this? And so this book is an exploration of the ways in which people are using the principles of epidemics to further their own ends. Some positive, some negative, some overt, some surreptitious. I'm very interested now in social engineering, in the kind of manipulation of the rules of epidemics for one purpose or another. And I'm very interested in the kind of difficult questions that arise when you take epidemics seriously. So a lot of the book is, like, for example, there's a chapter on COVID, it's a story of one of the biggest super spreading events of COVID. And the point of the chapter on COVID is that there is one thing about COVID that we failed to properly grasp during that pandemic. And that is that the overwhelming majority of people who are positive with COVID pose no real threat to anyone else. But the virus was being spread by a very, 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 very small number of people who were emitting orders of magnitude more viral particles when they breathed and sneezed and coughed than everybody else. In other words, if 1,000 people have COVID, there may be 5 people who are actually spreading it to others. Everyone else is really the COVID stops, they get it and doesn't go anywhere. Once you understand that, oh, wait a minute, the way we were fighting it, is all wrong, or at least not going to be very effective. So those 1,000 people, only 5 of them need to stay home. The other 995 can quite safely move through the world and not really be any major risk to others. But then there's an ominous thing, which is, okay, if we knew who those 5 people were, we could predict who they would be. What do you do with them?
What do you do with that? Right.
What do you do with that?
Right.
That's a hard question. I don't have a good answer to it. But my point is, the next time we have a pandemic, that's the question we're going to be asking. And someone's going to come to you, Carey, and say, Carey, we just figured out. Like these kinds, first of all, this thing is not randomly distributed. The idea is that there are certain people who, as a feature of their physiology, just emit more virus particles than everybody else. So if they will come to you and say, Carey, when you have a cold, everyone gets a cold. When you have the flu, everyone in your life gets the flu. And when you have COVID, everyone in your life is going to get COVID. You are a super spreader. We are now facing an outbreak of this new deadly respiratory virus. I'm sorry, you can't leave your house for the next 6 months. Now, what do we do with that? Oh, you can't, you can't. You want to go to a restaurant? No, you can't. Sorry. No, you want to fly on an airplane? They're not going to let you on an airplane, and no one's going to sit next to you if they do. Your family's going to say, well, what if this virus is deadly? Are they all going to leave you? I mean, it's just like the whole...
Wow.
This gets really, really difficult really, really quickly. And moreover, like, no, I mean, I don't even need to do the moreover. That chapter is just about, let's start having a conversation now about what happens the next time we have one of these, because I don't know the answer to these questions. These are hard questions. And we've been telling ourselves a fairy tale about the transmission of respiratory viruses because it's easier. It's easier to say we're all at risk of passing on our virus to somebody else. And it may be easier, but it's not true, right?
Wow.
Wow. So I do repeatedly through the book, I try and there's these occasions where I just say, look, it's the only way to do this properly is to have a conversation now. And if we don't, then other people will, go behind our backs and start using these principles of epidemics for some kind of nefarious end. That's not better than us having an honest conversation now.
Well, and back to the earlier idea of super spreaders, right? If that's true in viruses, it's also true in ideas, that you don't need 1,000 people to share your idea. But if 5 of the right people share this idea, for good or for bad, it can become the dominant thought in a heartbeat. That's sort of the idea behind it, right?
Yes. So I had raised this in my first book, The Tipping Point. I talked about connectors and salesmen and mavens as versions of this, people who carried much more of the burden of any kind of social epidemic. But now I think of this as the difference is the second time around is that I think the influence of these few, I called it the law of the few in my first book. Now I call it the law of the very, very few. I think it's way more concentrated in a small number of people than I previously had imagined. We're talking about 5 out of 1,000, not 15 out of 100. And so it's even more like I have a chapter on the opioid crisis without giving too much away. The point of that chapter ultimately is that what OxyContin, the makers of OxyContin realized was that they didn't need to convince the majority of doctors to prescribe their drug, OxyContin, in order for them to have a home run. They didn't even need to convince a small majority or even a minority. They needed to convince a couple of 100 doctors throughout the United States to start the most devastating overdose epidemic in the history of the world. Right? Like, that's weird. Like, so
that's what the charts that you include in the book certainly suggest.
It's hard, Carey, because our first impulse when we looked at this overdose epidemic, which was started by doctors prescribing painkillers inappropriately, was to say there's something wrong with the medical profession, right? No, there's nothing wrong with the medical profession. 99.9% of doctors behaved not just ethically, perfectly. Yeah. They did what they were supposed to do. They said, this is dangerous, I'm not going to... And then 0.01% didn't, and that was enough to spark an epidemic that now claims more than 100,000 lives a year in the United States. Like, that's scary. It's like a really, really complicated, scary, difficult idea.
And it was the app, again, not doing a spoiler alert here because that's where the book goes, but there was, you allege, the work of a pharmaceutical company and also a consulting company that said, yes, but if you do it this way, you will have even more market share of the opioid market. And they did, and they made gajillions of dollars off of it. And it was using that law of the very, very few to engineer something for their own personal gain at great social cost and the cost of over 100,000 human lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
No, hundreds of thousands, 100,000 human lives a year, hundreds of thousands of. Yeah, no, it's a kind of, but we've sort of known, to bring it back to your world, the story of the beginnings of Christianity. It's a story about a handful of people, right?
Super spreaders, the apostles.
It's just like, it's the apostles and it's Jesus. It's not like who are spreading the word in an extraordinarily large geographic area. Now, I know that they would recruit others, but the core story, it's not this kind of mass movement of, 200,000 people sign up at a massive, outdoor concert in Salonika, whatever. No, it's a very small group of people around one incredibly charismatic man, and that's sufficient to set in motion an epidemic that has lasted 2,000 years. That's the it is, as is always the case. The story is right there, has been right there in front of us for forever and ever.
So that gives those of us in positions, and this is a leadership podcast. So you have leaders, whether they run a company, whether they lead a church, whether they preach every weekend, or they do public speaking, or they're social media influencers, or whatever. We have disproportionate influence, each to his or her own. I would love to know, what are the ethical concerns when you have the power to change opinion? Like, what questions should we be asking as people who perhaps, you've got some super spreaders listening right now. What do we need to think about?
I mean, I think it has to do with leaders with that kind of moral authority need to have clear limits on. I don't mean this in a kind of institutional, there's a version of that that's kind of almost sort of punitive. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. I just think internally, someone who understands that they have that kind of authority needs to be very clear about the ends to which they're going to use it, right? They need to be able to say, I am trying to do this one specific thing. Because I think what happens, the danger comes when people start to drift away from their original purpose, when it becomes a cult of personality, when it becomes, when they kind of lose sight of whatever mission motivated them in the beginning. It's the drift. That's the problem. I don't think there's we're never going to get away from, nor do we want to get away from, a world where a small number of very charismatic people carry a kind of disproportionate load in leading us and spreading the word. That's what's beautiful.
It's always been thus, right?
Always been thus.
We're not getting rid of it.
We're not getting rid of it. It's about sort of understanding what that's for. I have a good friend who's a Mennonite pastor in Southern Ontario, and may have been listening to this podcast. If you're out there, Jim, a long time I always tell the story. I've told the story to my people many times, but years and years ago, we were at dinner, and a friend of mine, who Jim did not know, had come to dinner, and Jim was listening to him. And Jim, after the dinner, came out to me and said, "Jim, your friend is in a great deal of distress." And I almost wanted to kind of pull him aside and talk to him about what's going on in his life. And I was like, "What are you talking about?" I mean, I thought we were talking about everything. He seemed really good mood, blah, blah, blah. No idea what Jim was talking about. Within a couple of months, my friend, one of his kids committed suicide and his marriage broke up. And I just thought, Jim's got a gift, incredibly powerful gift for understanding what what people are going through.
Wow.
And, that's a gift. It's not trivial. You could imagine all kinds of scenarios where that could be used. If Jim wanted to be a con man, if he wanted to start a Ponzi scheme, there's any number of things he could do. Thankfully, he's a Mennonite minister. Like, that's not on his radar. But my point is, like, he knows exactly what he wants to. I think he knows he has that gift. He knows exactly what he wants to use it for, right? And it would never occur to him to. But there are lots of other people who, when they realize they're in a possession of that kind of gift, they don't place those kinds of restraints on themselves. That's where we get into trouble.
Well, and that leads me to, we teased it out earlier, but South Florida, Miami, right? So you paint the profile of this business person who appeared to be living a fairly ethical life, moves to South Florida at an interesting time, and suddenly finds himself the king of graft and corruption and greed and all of these things. And those stories always, well, they really terrify me. They grip me. It's like, oh, look inside, physician, heal thyself, be careful. It's almost like a culture, right, that can sweep you away when incentives are good enough. Can you tell some of that story and what you learned when you studied that case study?
Yeah. Well, I got very interested in this idea called small area variation, which is this idea that there are enormous differences in the way not people behave from one community to the next, but in the way communities behave.
Right.
That the simplest way to look at it is look at how medicine is practiced. People think medicine is practiced the same way all across North America. False.
Mm-hmm.
If you live in Buffalo, I use the example of Buffalo and Boulder, the kind of cardiology care you get in Boulder looks nothing like the kind of cardiology you get in Buffalo. It's not that one is better than the other. They're just wildly different. And there's also, got very into this because it struck me that epidemics, these are contagious behaviors that infect a community of practitioners of some, but they're local. The contagion stops at the border of the community, right? That's what interests me. So I got really interested in South Florida because South Florida turns out to be the Medicare fraud capital of America. No one else is even close. If there's a scam or something going on, it's happening in Miami. And the question is why? And so I tell the story of a guy who's a nursing home operator in Chicago who moved to Miami. And Miami got a hold of him. And in this way that was like so kind of both like weird and sort of a little bit hilarious. And it just like, it's all about the way that a place, an environment can corrupt you. It made me, I've always been a little bit of an environmentalist in the sense of that I think environments have much more of, our immediate context has much more of an influence on who we are and how we behave but this really cemented it for me. I just had no idea. I would never have, that chapter is the kind of most aggressive version of the contextual case for behavior that I've ever made. It really does seem to be the case that when people in certain professions move to Miami or South Florida, their behavior changes and not for the better. That there's just local norms that are different, and that if you never thought about doing fraud before you got to Miami, it'll come up once you move there. And what's funny as well is that I didn't really get into it in the chapter, but Miami is the fraud leader in like an insane number of different disciplines. It's a deeply, weirdly, hilariously corrupt place. And that's what I was trying to get at, this idea that we have this kind of notion that a contagion is something that's out of control, that just kind of spreads and you can't stop it. And that turns out to be absolutely false. Contagions belong to certain ecosystems, certain communities, they have boundaries and they respect the boundaries. And maybe, by the way, more than ever convinced that, the notion of a change is as good as a rest. You got some kid who's struggling and you're a parent, the value of, we all parents kind of know this, I guess. The value of moving your kid to a new environment cannot be understated. It really, 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 really makes a difference if you can choose the right new place. This was kind of proof of that principle.
Well, and what was interesting to me is that principle, and also the thing about Poplar Grove, where high achieving families, eventually drove their kids to despair. That talked to me about the importance of culture, and leaders set culture. Like if I'm in a culture, a geographic or denominational or cultural setting where everybody cheats and everybody lies and everybody inflates whatever. So for example, I worked at a law firm. If everybody just inflates the hours that they actually worked on a case to pad billing, it becomes easier to do that than if you're in a firm where it's like, well, are you sure you worked? Oh, you're right. I miscalculated. Okay, let me estimate that down, right? The integrity we have as leaders really dribbles down, like drifts down to everybody else in the organization. I'd love for you to talk about the importance, is it inevitable that if you move to Miami, and we do have Miami listeners, so I'm excited. I'll share the mailbag with you, Malcolm, when they hear this episode. Not everybody in Miami is corrupt. What you're arguing is the likelihood of you, if you have that in you, the likelihood of that being encouraged or fostered, where all the fraud is higher in that area than, say, Iowa or even Connecticut. I'm just curious how that works.
Well, it's not just... There is unconscious contagion. I go to a place and something that I used to think of as a gray area or a no-go area is suddenly being defined differently. People are kind of shrugging it off. And that becomes hard to resist after a while.
Right.
Then there's the deliberate version, which is if you're, like this guy I was profiling who's in the nursing home business, if your competitor is running a nursing home and they're cheating, and it's a difficult business to begin with, it becomes really, really hard for you to stay on the straight and narrow. You might go out of business, right?
Yeah.
So, there's a kind of existential choice that people have to make, which is, do I fight this and potentially put my livelihood at risk? Or do I just say, I don't have any choice? That's the way business is done here. That's, for years and years and years in New York, everybody who had garbage, every commercial, the trash, the waste removal business was dominated by the mafia through the 1980s or 90s even. And otherwise upstanding people paid a surcharge to mafia waste companies to take the garbage away because they didn't have a choice. Was that, or nobody would take your garbage, or somebody would disrupt your business in some way. Like, these are honest people who are being forced by their environment into that kind of, for competitive reasons. So there's a little bit of both going on. There is that kind of culture setting. I get swept up in something, and then there's a kind of rational version where people say, I don't have any choice. I got to do. Both are deeply problematic, and both are can only be fixed by some kind of. That's what leaders are there to do, is to fix those kinds of problems and to set a new tone and say, this is the appropriate standard of behavior here. And that is something that I don't think we can take for granted. Like, if you lose that, something kind of leaches out of the culture of your organization.
Yeah, it's sort of one of those, as for me in my house, this is what we're going to do, right? Or as Jesus would say, among you, it'll be different.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good reminder for those of us who have influence or leadership. I'm curious, because you say it's a darker world now than it was in 2000, and I have a working memory of 2000, and I would agree with that. That's come up numerous times on the podcast over the years. I wonder what writing Revenge, like Revenge at the Tipping Point, did for your sense of optimism or cynicism. I mean, I find myself at my age and my stage, I want to be an optimist, but some days it's a fight. It's like, this is a decision I'm making, not an emotion I'm feeling.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to you as you kind of looked at the shadow side of the tipping point, that sometimes it isn't always used for good?
Yeah.
How's that internal battle going on inside you these days, Malcolm?
Well, I'm sort of a congenital optimist, so it's hard to dislodge my optimism. And I feel like identifying, uh, malevolent actors and detailing their strategies and alerting us to the way in which we are being cheated or is a form of optimism. I mean, it's like, what the games that, Purdue Pharmaceutical were playing around OxyContin that caused this, here they are. There's a pattern here.
Here's the strategy of the enemy. Here's the strategy.
Here's what it tells us. Here's how we can defend it next time. It's not this black box that there's no reason, in other words, to be passive. I think what the book is really addressing is the tendency to want to curl up into a little ball and say there's nothing I can do. And I think there's always something you can do. And so each one of these chapters is an invitation to, I think, a more kind of positive response to the world, a kind of proactive response to the world. There's that long chapter on kind of the fun chapter on why does Harvard have a women's rugby team is, it's like, it tells you something. It's like, here's what they're doing. Here's why they're doing it. Draw your own conclusions. Maybe your conclusion should be, I'm going to stop venerating Harvard University in the way I did before. And that would be a very useful thing to come out of it. It's not I'm not being cynical. I'm just saying, I'm not being despairing. I'm just saying, look, it's what they're doing, right? They're playing a game here. Like, just be aware of the game and adjust your expectations accordingly.
What is one thing you wish somebody would ask you about that nobody ever asks you about? You get a lot of questions fired your way.
I get a lot of questions fired my way. Well, which of the ideas that I hold are bad ideas?
Okay, that's a great one. Which of the ideas you hold are bad ideas, Malcolm?
I have a long-standing aversion to air conditioning. I believe the world would be better off with no air conditioning, which I recognize is a bad idea, but I will hold to it nonetheless.
Are you sweltering during this podcast, or is this pushing the industries?
I'm sadly in an air-conditioned place. I would not. No, that's sort of a trivial example. I think I am. I'm a running snob. That's a bad thing. I have a belief that if someone is a good athlete, that makes them a better person.
Oh,
which
really?
is just wrong.
Uh-huh.
It's wrong. It's a bad idea. I just can't help. I can't shake. It's this weird thing. If you're too heavily into sports as I am, there's a point where you cross over and you come to think of physical talent as a form of virtue. And it is an incredibly pernicious idea. And it leads you astray in all kinds of subtle ways you don't understand. But I recognize that in myself, but I can't really stop it. I just sort of think, oh, so-and-so ran a 2-hour and 6-minute marathon. They must be really smart and interesting. I literally think that.
So that the more fit you are, particularly in running, the more virtuous you are as a human being.
I have joked that if I ran a highly selective elite university, I would only let in people who could run under a 5:30 mile. And I would just think, I think it would be a better school if everyone could run it. Now, in point of fact, that is completely and utterly false. But I do actually believe that.
Isn't that interesting? Any other ideas? Anything? I mean, you're revisiting the tipping point. I heard you, what was it? When you did the monk debate in Toronto a few years ago, it didn't go particularly well.
That was terrible. Yeah. It was not of my best.
Was it Douglas Murray you were up against? God. Yeah.
Somebody warned me about him. I should have listened. Anyway, yes. It went badly.
But what you did was you did a podcast series on how you blew the debate and what you might do differently. And didn't you put yourself through like a debating or a public speaking course or something like that?
I went and got schooled on how to be a better debater.
Are there any big ideas? Like that's a do-over moment you wish you had back. Are there any big ideas you've written about or publicly shared over the years that you're like, oh, I think I was wrong on that?
Yeah, although, it's funny, the debate, I wouldn't have said I regretted screwing up in the monk debate. I'm actually glad I screwed up because had I not screwed up, suppose I had just done a standard debate, suppose we had won, I would have taken away nothing from the experience. It would not have been an opportunity to be. By the way, if I'd spent like 2 more hours preparing, I could have done fine. I just didn't properly prepare, didn't think about it properly. So if I'd done that, I wouldn't have done any soul searching. I wouldn't have gone and had someone teach me about debating. I wouldn't be a better debater as a result. I mean, nothing would have happened. It was only because I screwed up that I took steps to improve my performance. So I'm actually grateful. In the grand scheme of things, I'm grateful I screwed up. You learn more from your mistakes than, once you recognize you learn more from your mistakes than you do from your successes, you realize actually it's probably really, really useful to screw up every now and again. And if you're going to screw up big. So you're forced to.
Yeah. Well, you did it publicly too, right? Yeah. Which is, but then you took your learning and your lessons public too, which I really admire. I thought that was brilliant.
That was, I do think, if you read all of my books, I've been having an argument with myself about crime for the last 25 years. And every time I think about crime, I think about it. I re-examine what I believe and I come up with it's a subject, I'm sort of obsessed with crime and how to stop it and its consequences. And I'm continually impressed by how easy it is to jump to conclusions, how often I have been wrong in the prescriptions I've given, and how the only honest position is you cannot be it's a mistake to be certain about this subject, that there are so many different and deep roots to why people would behave in why people would commit crimes, that you can't just have a simple prescription. The only thing can be said with certainty is that we don't do a very good job of dealing with it. That's all I can say with certainty. But I have been, at various times in my life, I would not have been that. I would have said, "Oh no, here's the way to do it. Oh yeah, this is the solution." And the process of the last 25 years of this debate I've been having with myself has been a steady retreat from certainty. That's, I think, even I go home to Ontario and in Kitchener-Waterloo, on the police cars, it says, on the slogan on the back is "People helping people."
Oh, wow.
Which I love. But then I say to myself, I love that sentiment. But also, it is an awful lot easier to be a police officer in Kitchener-Waterloo than it is in the American South. Think about the historical legacy you're dealing with. Think about the public institutions. Think about the quality of the schools. Think about the mix of, Waterloo is a place filled with people who came from all over the world to make their lives better. They're not shooting each other in drunken rages. It's just a different world. So do I know whether I look at people helping people, I think, well, look, there's something beautiful here about the way policing is conceptualized. But even if that's true, that doesn't answer the question of why there's so much lower crime rate in Kitchener-Waterloo than there is in Birmingham, Alabama, right? So I'm just every time you examine the issue, I think you come away humbled and saying, it's just a tiny piece of this incredibly complex mosaic, The dominant culture in Kitchener-Waterloo is Mennonites preaching pacifism. You don't think that has an effect on the crime rate?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If we could magically move every Mennonite from the KW area to various places around the world, don't you think that would lower the crime rate? Yes. You have a third grade teacher whose name is Brenda Bauman. You don't think Brenda Bauman gives you a different view of the world than someone who comes from a culture that never even thought about nonviolence? Right? I don't know what to do with, that's my point. The more you learn, the more you just think it's complicated. And people who tell you they know what the solution is are probably wrong.
Well, what you've done so beautifully, Malcolm, is you've set yourself up by holding your ideas loosely and being willing to go, oh, you know what? I'm not so sure what I said 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago is maybe the right take on it. And here's another take. Or, you're holding it loosely. I think the trap that's so easy for us to fall into, for those of us who ever have a microphone in front of us or, are preaching on a weekend or holding a position of leadership, is that we feel shackled to our ideas. In other words, I said this 5 years ago, or I said this 10 years ago. I'm not sure I believe it anymore, but I said it 10 years ago and I don't want to be publicly wrong or contradict myself. So I'm just going to hold to it. And that, of course, just becomes less and less tenable as time goes on, and it creates a great dissonance in us. I'm curious, are you naturally wired that way, or is that something you had to develop or intentionally commit to say, I'm going to hold some of my big ideas, which have sold millions of copies, loosely?
Yeah. Well, I think if I had to be totally honest, I would say that I believe it's way more fun to hold your ideas loosely. I also believe it's the right thing to do. It's functional. It's ethically correct. It has all kinds of broader, but fundamentally for me, the motivation was that it's boring to make up your mind and stick to it forever on issues that are ever changing, right? It just struck me as like, I actually delight in learning something that upends my worldview because it's like everything's fresh again. It's like it's like why do kids love Etch-a-Sketch? Remember Etch-a-Sketch?
Oh, yeah.
They love it because you shake it and you give a brand new screen again. And I watch my daughter with Etch-a-Sketch, and like the fun part is, the most fun thing is not the drawing on the Etch-a-Sketch. The most fun thing is getting rid of the drawing on the Etch-a-Sketch. You draw so you get rid of it. Like that's what's driving, right? That's the motivation there. It's like, let's mess it up and start over. And like the look of glee on her face when she's like, right? Like that's the thing that I agree with. I'm with her on that. Like, let's shake it. And maybe you draw the exact same thing. Maybe you decide the second time around, the thing I did is the thing I want to redo. Fine. But you're going to shake it up. And that's a kind of very, very useful moment, fun moment.
The freedom in that, when you really think about it, for the next couple of decades is fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, really, when you think about your next 20 years and what you're going to contribute, or I think about my next 20 years, we have our values, we have our beliefs, we have the things that we hold dearly. But the ability to say, I don't take myself too seriously. I could be wrong. Oh, why don't I learn something here? Why don't I go on an unstructured, inductive journey and see where it leads me? And maybe I don't take a map and let's see what we discover. I really, really appreciate that framing. If there was one thing, last question, Malcolm, that you wish the church would be doing differently right now in this moment, what do you wish we would be doing differently right now?
I mean, I don't know if I have an answer that is different from what people within the church have been saying, but I think that meeting people where they are, I realize it's a very kind of vague thing, but the church used to be at the center of the culture. It's not anymore. And I can't keep pretending that it is. And I don't think that means changing what it's saying. I think it means changing where it is. That increasingly I come to think of the notion of a big fancy church with huge carrying costs that uses it once a week as an anachronistic notion that worked fine in the 18th century and the 19th century. Is that really where we want to be in the 21st? It's that kind of thing. Because I don't think the relevance of the message is more relevant than ever. It's just the delivery is a little bit seems to me hasn't kept pace with the way the culture has moved. That would be like I said, I don't think that's an original statement, but
no, but that's helpful. And there are young leaders listening who are ready to go off the map and wonder where it takes them and take the message in fresh directions.
I did a podcast episode last year on this guy who's the president of Hope College. It's a religious college in Michigan, and who took over. And the first question he asked was, what would our college look like if we took Jesus teaching seriously? And his answer was, he wants to make college free, to find a way to decouple economic necessity from an education. And he's embarked on this big, massive campaign. But that's the example of what I'm talking about. He was like, your college should represent what you believe to be the most important thing in Christian teaching. It's not a Sunday thing, it's a school year thing. And they should have an engagement with the people who graduate from this school for the rest of their lives based around that notion. So like that's what I mean by someone who has moved to teaching to where the culture is. It's like that, it's that. And I have I don't know whether he'll succeed or not, but it's a guy named Matthew Scogan at Hope College. I just have enormous, by the way, you should have him on your podcast.
Okay, I'll have to look. I don't think I heard that episode.
It's called, it's about Hope College, SCOGIN. And he's just brilliant. I love him.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Well, that's new to me. Malcolm, I can't thank you enough. This has been great. I loved Revenge of the Tipping Point.
Thank you.
I am very, very excited to see that get out into the wild. It's available everywhere by the time this airs. And if people want to follow you online these days, where's a really good place to connect?
Well, I guess Twitter, although I barely tweet. Not much.
Yeah.
I've
Your podcast.
Podcast, Revisionist History, is the best place to keep in touch with me. Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Malcolm, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carey.